Hi, thanks for clicking on this video. We're here at Trinity Wesleyan Church so that we can unleash hope to those around us, and that includes you. So thank you for being a part of what's going on in our church, even through technology. We hope that this video is a blessing to you, and at the end, you're going to see some next steps and ways that you can get involved even after this video is done.
In the tapestry of our faith, there are threads of truth woven through the tough questions that arise from the sacred pages of the Bible. As the city lights shimmer, so do the uncertainties that may have lingered in the corners of our faith. We embark on a journey of discovery, diving into the tough questions that pop up in our everyday conversations and challenge our modern perspectives. Questions that make us pause, reflect, and yearn for a deeper connection with the divine. As we grapple with these questions, let us remember that seeking answers is a sacred act, a testament to the sincerity of our faith. In a world of online debates and arguing, let's boldly face the questions that challenge our beliefs and spark conversations. Let's dive into the richness of God's Word, trusting that in seeking answers, we're not only discovering ancient wisdom, but also applying it to the challenges of today. Together, let's navigate the modern landscape of faith, knowing that the tough questions are not obstacles, but stepping stones towards a more profound understanding.
Today is going to be a very important subject and a very important message. I want to give you the best information on this subject, and I'm not really going to be interjecting my thoughts or opinions, but this is the best information and the best sermon that I can find to give you on the subject of divorce. This is a sermon that has been given out through the Wesleyan Church's District Board of Ministerial Development for over a decade. This is the board that pastors have to go through to be a Wesleyan pastor to become ordained, and you have to meet with this board 1 or 2 times a year for around 4 or 5 years until you are ordained. Like the Wesleyan Church, we want our pastors to be healthy spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and that's a good thing, to make sure that we don't ordain those who are in it for the wrong reasons. So I want to tread carefully on the subject of divorce because there are so many connotations and so many hurts through and from the topic of divorce. And we'll hit most of those reasons today. So today, our third tough question of the Bible is divorce okay? Is divorce okay? I want to say a few words at the beginning because this is kind of a tender subject. Some of you are here today and you're concerned about the state of marriage in our society and thinking like, man, I hope this message really hits the value of commitments and making that promise. Some of you are struggling in a marriage and you're not sure what you want to hear right now. Some of you grew up in a family and went through a divorce when you were a little child and you still feel the pain and sorrow from that. Some of you may have been through the pain of a divorce as a husband or a wife, and maybe even have been to a church where they give a message that divorce is the unforgivable sin or made you feel like you're damaged goods. Churches a lot of times can shoot its own hurting people sometimes. I want you to know that my hope is this message will offer a lot of hope and a lot of healing. More and more, I feel a changing tide of that marriage is only when we feel like loving each other. There was a woman at one of our churches, as she was walking down the aisle, she thought to herself, I wonder how long this marriage will last. It's becoming more and more popular, a very popular choice among those getting married in our country. And we have in our country basically a try before you buy warranty that you want to try it out, see if it works. Then maybe after a couple of years, maybe you'll actually vow to keep that promise that you already promised. Marriage is a holy act and is sanctioned by God Himself. Some of you may be thinking this is kind of a controversial subject. Is it okay that we talk about this? And the answer to that is, of course, Jesus talked about it. And anything that Jesus talked about, we can talk about. and He'll help us as we do it. So we're going to get into it. But I'm going to warn you that this will involve walking through a lot of information today. So we're going to roll up our sleeves, and you'll have to really listen hard and try to understand some new concepts. I ask that you be patient, stay with us, stay through the whole thing so you understand everything from beginning to end. Way back in the ancient world, and even before the Old Testament, the ancient Near East was pretty much governed by the Hammurabi Code. Some of you have heard about this code when you were in high school or maybe in college. If you are a wife under the Hammurabi Code, your husband could divorce you at any time for any reason just by walking out of the house. You would be stuck with the kids if you had any. You'd have no money. Let's say you had sons and found a way to raise them. They might get old enough to work the farm and turn a profit to help you. Then your ex-husband could come and return at any time that he wanted to, reclaim you, reclaim the kids and the money and the farm and everything that you have made for yourself. What that meant was if you were a wife and your husband left, even though you technically could remarry, the reality is that no man would ever marry you. If husband number one was lurking around out there somewhere, and he could come back as a possibility. So if you're a woman in that world and your marriage broke up, you were in trouble. In that day, divorce involved a lot of connotation around money and finances, but fortunately in our day, people are mature when they're going through a divorce, and they hardly ever thought about money in their marriage, but they only did back then. Women were very vulnerable in the ancient world. One of the aspects of the law of Moses compared to the law of the ancient Near East or the Hammurabi Code was that the law of Moses had concern for women. You heard that right? They had concern for women. The law of Moses had a concern for women. Most people that the Old Testament was harshly against women, that it's all about the patriarchy, it's all about these things, but it's very clear from Genesis that God's intent for marriage, that it be permanent, that it is a commitment from a husband and a wife, and if it did break up, Moses said in Deuteronomy 24, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Now, this certificate was a way of protecting the woman because it meant the first husband could never come back. He could never reclaim her, reclaim anything that she's done for herself. The certificate always had a phrase on it, and it would say, you are free to remarry any Jewish man or any Jewish woman that you wish, if it was a guy that, or if it was the woman that had left. Deuteronomy here mentions divorce on the grounds of indecency. In the Hebrew, it reads, for the cause of sexual immorality. So this raises the question, what about other cases? We know deep down that someone being unfaithful, yeah, there's probably grounds for divorce, and we think that, we know that, but where scripturally does it talk about? Was there provision for divorce because of abuse? Deep down, we believe that if you're being abused, yes, leave, get safe. Or if the man or woman abandoned. Those cases were covered in a roundabout way. So we go to Exodus chapter 21, we find another classic text on divorce. The law here covers the question, what happens if a man takes a second wife? And it's designed to protect the interest of the first wife. Exodus 21, it says, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her, the first wife's food, her clothing, or her conjugal love. If he does not provide her with those three things, she is free to go without payments of money. It's Exodus 21, 10 through 11. Once again, the law is seeking to protect the woman. In this case, the husband takes a new wife, and human nature being what it is, the new wife tends to get the good stuff, and so the law, when he, the husband, married his first wife, he made a vow to provide support, food or clothing, and love. So if he breaks that vow, then the first wife is free to leave, free to get a divorce, free to get a certificate, free to remarry. So over time, the rabbis looked at these two passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy They looked at these two passages that became the classic text in the scriptures governing divorce. They said, here's the principle that is involved. Based on these texts, marriage involves a vow, and those vows include three primary promises: fidelity, to be faithful to your spouse; no sexual unfaithfulness, Deuteronomy 24; to provide food, clothing, so on, Exodus 21; sexual intimacy and affection. Marriage is a vow to be faithful, to provide, and to love. When these vows are broken, the victim of the broken vows has a right to get divorced, male or female. That would include the right to be remarried. There was no such thing in Judaism as a divorce that did not include the right to remarry. That was the idea behind the certificate. So rabbis would debate what constituted breaking of these vows because they took them very seriously. How much food is included in the promise? What about clothing? What about conjugal love? Basically physical intimacy. This is the kind of things that the rabbis did. They came up with rules around the idea of physical intimacy. It says that the husband had to offer to be physically intimate with his wife at least twice per week, or she had the right to divorce him if he didn't do that. They made exceptions in some cases. For instance, if he was a donkey driver and he's out on the road all the time, she had the right to divorce him if he only offered, or if he didn't offer sex at least one time a week. They figured it was like being a truck driver on the road, like we would understand. If he was unemployed, this goes into further, a husband had to at least make the offer of physical intimacy every night, 7 nights a week, or his wife could divorce him. Not making that up. They were probably all unemployed rabbis or something like that. They were probably like, yeah, it needs every day. I don't know. Did rabbis believe that biblical grounds for divorce could include things like abandonment or abuse? Of course they did. Abandonment would simply be the extreme form of breaking the vow to provide. Abuse would be the extreme of breaking the vow to love. In Israel, those would be grounds for divorce. That didn't mean that anybody believed God believed divorce was a good idea. It wasn't a good idea, but this is a way of preventing worse injustice and suffering when vows are broken. That's the framework for marriage and divorce in ancient Israel. So we fast forward. In Jesus' day, there's a new development. Two of the most famous rabbis who lived a few decades before Jesus and dominated the rabbinic teaching were named Hillel and Shammai. They were kind of like the big dogs among the rabbis. Like if they were going on a teaching circuit and they had book deals, this is kind of what I'm thinking. But schools were founded around those two people to interpret the law. Hillel looked at the law in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, where Moses says a man can divorce his wife for a cause of sexual immorality. And Hillel reflected on this text and said Moses could have said that a man could divorce his wife for sexual immorality, but he includes this phrase, for the cause of sexual immorality. Why does he include that phrase? The rabbis loved the text. They loved every word and believed that no word was random or redundant. Hillel reasoned that this word must refer to another cause, a different grounds for divorce besides sexual immorality. Since it was the word cause, Hillel concluded that it must mean any cause. In other words, Hillel said that Deuteronomy 24 meant a man could divorce his wife for two reasons, sexual immorality or any cause. The rabbis in his school were men. They decided that any cause divorce would be available to only one gender. Anybody want to guess what gender that was? Men, husbands, any cause, Hillel said. And that covered just about any fault you could think of. Again, rabbis would list different faults they believed a husband could divorce his wife for under this any cause provision. They listed things like if a wife spoiled her husband's dinner, he could divorce her under any cause. If she walked around with her hair unbound, her husband could divorce her because it was considered improper. If she argued in a loud voice enough to be heard in the next house, he could divorce her. If she made you watch a romantic comedy, he could divorce her. That one I made up. The one drawback to the any cause, there's more, but one of the drawbacks to the any cause divorce is that it was very expensive. It was more expensive than the other, than Shammai. If the husband could prove that the spouse had committed adultery or abuse in court, then a husband would not have to pay the ketubah. The marriage inheritance is what the ketubah is, that was promised at the wedding. So if he got the any clause divorce, then he had to pay the inheritance. So it's more expensive. Hillel is saying, now there's a new divorce option available. It's never been available in the history of Israel, the any cause divorce available to any husband. Soon, as you might imagine, it became the most popular form of divorce in Israel. Although you may not have known that you actually know, many of you actually know of a case in the Bible where an any cause divorce was considered. You remember the story in the New Testament where Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant? In Matthew 1:19, it says, because Joseph did not want to expose her to the public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce Mary quietly. Now, that word quietly is not just a vague adjective, it's a technical term. What Joseph decided is he would not take Mary to court and prove that she was guilty of adultery, which would have let him off the hook for the marriage inheritance promise. He decided to get an any cause divorce. No proof of adultery, no scandal. That means he would have to swallow the financial costs and the support and to support the child. That's exactly the situation that is referred to in the story of Mary and Joseph. It's an innovation of the Rabbi Hillel. The other important rabbi, Shammai, disagreed. He said, no, Deuteronomy 24 only refers to divorce being allowed for sexual immorality. Of course, Shammai would have agreed that divorce could also happen on the basis of Exodus 21 when the vow for provision was broken, or when the vow for love was broken. But when it comes to Deuteronomy 24, Shammai said an any cause divorce is wrong. It is bad interpretation. It was not correct. In Jesus' day, this caused a big debate between the rabbis who followed Hillel and the rabbis who followed Shammai. And everyone wanted to know exactly where the rabbis stood on this subject. It's like the way in our day we ask politicians, where do you stand on loan forgiveness? Where do you stand on stronger border walls? Or are you pro? Are you con? This is kind of where they were putting Jesus in. This brings us to Jesus. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus to test him and to trap him, and they asked him in Matthew 19, verse 3, it says, they asked him, is it lawful for a man to cause his wife for any cause? In my opinion, they're not asking what the Christian church has largely understood to be. They're not asking, Rabbi, is divorce always against the law? That was never debated in that day. Divorce was in Moses' law. No rabbi would have ever asked, is it lawful for us to follow Moses' law? It was in the law. It was the law given to Moses by God. What they're asking is, Jesus, how do you interpret Deuteronomy 21? Do you agree with Hillel or Shammai? And the Pharisees were not even really interested in Jesus' answer. The text says they came to test or trap him. So a little bit of background that might help you here. In that day, the ruler in Galilee was a man named Herod, King Herod. Herod had been married to his first wife, but while he was married, he fell in love with another woman named Herodias. Unfortunately, Herodias was also married to Herod's brother. This is like divorce court. This is soap operas during the day. So Herod got a divorce from his first wife, and he talked Herodias into divorcing his own brother so he could marry her, which would have made things very awkward at Christmas, but that was before Christmas, so that wasn't a problem. John the Baptist heard about this and confronted King Herod about it. He said, it is not lawful for you to have Herodias as your wife, because you got an any cause divorce to get her. This is from Mark chapter 6, verse 18. And Herod took this great, and he was totally fine. No, does anybody know what happened to John the Baptist? He lost his head over it. This is a loaded question that they're asking Jesus, and they know it. This is why they pose the question to Jesus, and so Jesus goes back to the beginning of the Torah. In Genesis, it says, "A man shall leave his father and mother, the two shall become one flesh." By the way, in Hebrews, it just says they shall become one flesh. What Jesus is doing is he adds two, saying that polygamy is not really God's plan either. The two shall become one. God's purpose for marriage, a husband and a wife make a permanent, intimate commitment. And then the Pharisees said, "Why then did Moses command that the man give his wife to a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning." And Jesus goes on to say that it's not just for sexual immorality. If you do the any cause deal, you're wrong. If you do that and get remarried, which would have been the expectation in that culture, that is adultery. Because the only grounds that Jesus mentions here is sexual immorality. Some people have thought that the New Testament position is the only biblical grounds for divorce for sexual immorality. This has led to anguish and heartbreak and confusion, and I believe a lot of tragedy. I've heard this kind of thing. You mean that if my husband beats me or beats our children, is addicted to drugs and addicted to alcohol, he steals money, tries to kill me, I have to stay married to him? But if he strays one time sexually, then I can get a divorce? Like, people have thought this is what it means to be biblical on this issue. There's a heart-wrenching story that a pastor was talking about a guy who kidnapped his 9-year-old daughter, made a horrible phone call to his wife, took up his daughter in a plane, and deliberately crashed it and killed them both. Crashed it into his ex-mother-in-law's house. There are women saying, "You mean he can threaten me? He can threaten to kill my child, and I still can't divorce him? He did all those things, but technically I don't have any grounds for divorce." That's not what Jesus was saying. Here, Jesus is not talking about the whole Jewish framework of marriage and divorce. That was a part of his world as a rabbi. He's not discussing what happens when vows of Exodus 21, provision and love, are broken. He's talking about the Hillel Shammai debate, and any person in that culture would have recognized it. There are other places in the New Testament where it's summarized even more briefly, but first century readers would have understood this. A similar situation in our day would be if someone asked, "Do you think it's okay for a 16-year-old to drink?" And we're automatically going to supply the words "drink alcohol." "Oh, you want to go get a drink?" "Oh, you're talking about water?" No, like we have connotations with what we already believe that to mean. First century readers understood this debate that was going on. "Oh, you're talking about divorce, Hillel and Shammai," like everybody knew the juicy gossip, like everybody's spilling the tea about this. What is your interpretation of Deuteronomy 24:1? Jesus' response to that when he was pushed, he says, "I'm a Shammai guy. Like, I'm against any cause divorce." And he was shared the understanding that biblically where the vows of marriage from Deuteronomy 24 and Exodus 21, where those vows are broken and where there is, again, hard-heartedness, then divorce may well be the only option for them. And I want to be very direct here for a moment. If you are in an abusive situation, if you or your children are in danger, you need to get out now. You need to get safe. Jenna and I have helped people get out of situations that are difficult where there's abuse. We will do it again. And too often the church has not spoken clearly on this. Wise Christian counseling can help. Being in Christian community is important. Do you not think that obedience to God means remaining in a situation where you and your children's lives are in danger? That's not biblical. It's not loving. It's not wise. And it's not Jesus' teachings. If you're in an abusive relationship, get safe now. If you need help, slip us a note, text us, message the church. Whatever you need to do, we will help you do. We see another indicator that the Acts 2 church understood that this was Jesus' teaching in Paul's writing to the church at Corinth. You need to know that marriage as an institution in the Roman world was not in great shape. Things were not going well. The Emperor Caesar Augustus had seen that Roman men were avoiding marriage so that they could engage in multiple relationships, sexual relationships, even affairs. It's hard to believe that men would do something like that. That's crazy. But in the ancient world, they did. Caesar was so concerned by the lack of legal sons being born into Roman households that he actually established a law in 18 BC making it compulsory for Roman citizens to get married. If you got divorced within 18 months, you had to be remarried. Partly because of this, divorce was very easy in Rome. By Roman law, you could get a divorce just by walking out the door, walking out on your spouse, walking out on your family. That's how the divorce went in ancient Rome. The world that the early church faced was full of wide-scale cohabitation, sexual immorality, compulsory marriage laws, and divorce as easy as walking out the door. Marriage was a disaster in their day. Paul writes to the little church at Corinth and says, don't do that. Don't live like that. Honor your marriage vows. Don't sink down to the Roman bar. Live up to God's standard. Even if you've married an unbeliever and you become a Christian, you seek to honor your promise to that person. Now there's further teaching. But if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever leaves, again in the Roman world, that is a divorce, let that person do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances, Paul writes to the Corinthian church in chapter 7. In other words, if your spouse abandons you, then the marriage is over. You are free to remarry in the Lord. Paul adds a little later to another believer. Paul would not understand himself to be amending Jesus or amending anything that had been talked about. He's not tacking on additional grounds for divorce. He's not adding abandonment as another grounds for divorce in addition to adultery. He would have understood that he and Jesus were in agreement with the framework that they grew up with and were teaching out of. That the teaching of the Old Testament was that marriage was a vow to be faithful, a vow to provide, and a vow to love. Sexual faithfulness includes not having an affair with another woman. But it also includes not having a life of chronic indulgence in pornography or something similar. It is a vow, and God's intent is to last forever. And sometimes vows are broken. That does not mean that divorce is okay, even if vows are broken. That does not mean that divorce is okay. Sometimes in churches, people have been legalistic about this and said, oh, my spouse has been unfaithful to me one time. Now, automatically, I have grounds for divorce. Not necessarily. The key is hard-heartedness. Are they willing to change? Remember the religious leader said, why did Moses command us to get divorced? Jesus answered, no, Moses did not command. Moses permitted divorce because of hard-heartedness. The idea here is that even if a marriage vow is broken, if a spouse is repenting, if they are going to change their ways, if they're soft-hearted, able to be molded, willing to reconcile, then seek to rebuild the marriage. But if the spouse refuses to repent, if there's a stubborn, hard-hearted, defiant decision to reject the reconciliation, reject intimacy, reject God, reject His ways, reject rebuilding, then it may be the only option would be divorce. When there's the breaking of vows and a chronic hard-hearted spirit, then it's only one way. That's the teaching of Jesus and of the Scriptures. I believe on the issue of a divorce and remarriage, but I want to say a few pastoral words because we've gone through a lot of information, but there's not an abstract situation. Everybody has been or will be touched by divorce in some way or another, whether you have, whether you're a child of divorce. Some of you have had your heart broken by it. Some of you have been beat up by it and wondering, is there any life for me after divorce? And I want to tell you that there is. I want to tell you one more divorce in the Bible and about what happened on the other side. The most striking picture that the prophets used to describe God's relationship to Israel was that it was a marriage. God made a covenant with Israel because he loved her. They took a vow God would provide for her, care for her, love her, and she was to love God in return. But God's people were unfaithful to him. If you go through the Old Testament often, most powerfully idolatry is expressed as a form of adultery, unfaithfulness. And it leads to one of the most amazing and hard to hear statements in all of Scripture. And this is God saying in Jeremiah, I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Do you understand what God is saying here? God goes through a divorce. In the book of Malachi, God says, I hate divorce. A lot of people in churches know that statement. Oh, they said, oh, God hates divorce. There's no reason for divorce. Do you want to know why God hates divorce? He's been through it. And this is going to blow your mind. If you don't hear the anguish in God's heart, then you don't know it yet. God says, I've been through the humiliation of being rejected. He says, I know all about the pain of betrayal. I know about all the anguish of broken vows from hard-hearted people. The prophets of Israel say that God is a divorcee. So God invented the first divorce recovery program at a place called Calvary, where Jesus died for our sins, and the price for the course was one blood-stained cross. Jesus paid the price for all of us, for you and for me, and God was the first one to go through it. It's still in session for anyone who wants to join in that redemption. It's not just a back then thing, it is a today thing as well. In Hosea chapter 2, it says, in that day, declares the Lord, I will betroth you to me forever. Forever I will betroth you in righteousness, in justice, in love, and compassion. There's love and compassion at the cross for hard-hearted vow breakers like you and like me. When it comes to divorce, we're all on the wrong side of it. We've all been unfaithful to God. And this is why in any church that divides people up into superior, non-divorced, first-class Christians and inferior, beat-up, divorced, second-class Christians is theologically in error and spiritually destructive. On the most important spiritual level, every one of us has been unfaithful. We all need the cross. And that's what we want to be as a church. By the way, marriages need Jesus. If you don't know him, you can turn your life over to him. You can come to the cross, go through the divorce recovery program, come out on the other side and be betrothed to God. You can do that today. If you're thinking about getting married to someone and you know Jesus and you have made a commitment to God and that other person in your life does not know Jesus, I need to warn you. I want to encourage you. I want to plead with you. Don't get married to someone who does not share that ultimate faith commitment. It will be terrible for your life. If you're already in a marriage and you're struggling and you can feel your heart getting hardened, if there's any way that we can help, that we can serve you, we'd love to do that. You can call the church office, you can message us. We will help you through different ways to bring about redemption in your marriage and give you a place to speak your pain. We'll come alongside you and your spouse, walk through the issues with you. We can help you get counseling if it's beyond what Jen or I could help you with. We could get you to a Christian counselor if that would help. We'd love to help you in that process. Maybe you've been through a divorce. Maybe you fought desperately to avoid it, and maybe you shoulder a fair amount of responsibility and guilt from it. But you can get healing from God. You can know grace and you can know forgiveness. You don't have to be stuck in anger or guilt. So we go back to our third tough question. Is divorce okay? And like many subjects in the Bible, it depends. Like many of the tough questions that we're going to talk about, it depends. There are 4 biblical reasons for divorce if, and only if, they're hard-hearted and they've chosen to break their vow long-term, that they don't want reconciliation. There's 4 biblical reasons. Number 1 is sexual immorality or unfaithfulness, cheating. Lack of provision. I'm not talking about lack of provision like, oh, he doesn't give me enough diamonds, he doesn't give me enough DoorDash, he doesn't buy me new cars, and all these different things. Food and clothing. If you have food, if you have clothing. Lack of provision also includes cases of abuse. The third reason for divorce is lack of sexual intimacy. Not saying like, oh, I demand sex every day, noon and midnight. Like, it's along the lines of when God said that the two shall become one. There is a oneness in sex. Marriage is a oneness. That it helps us to know our spouse, to know God, to understand our spouse and be connected at a level that is more than just physical. And the last reason is for abuse. We've gone through a lot of options for divorce, but I think what some people need to hear today is that there is healing, there is hope, you're not damaged, you are still loved. I think what God is saying to all of us here, He says, if you'll let me, I'd love to heal your hurts. I've been where you are and I want to help you through your pain.